for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Vitiligo Society for kindly inviting me to talk about this extremely important subject about quality of life and giving me the chance to introduce a new app that we've developed at Cardiff University to help monitor quality of life changes and quality of life impact of various skin diseases, including vitiligo. So, like has already been said, I'm Dr. Faraz Ali. I work at Cardiff University, but also a consultant dermatologist in Newport. And really, quality of life is something I never really understood properly until my tenure at Cardiff University, when I sort of happened to fall into the subject. And it's one of the reasons I grew to love dermatology, because of the assessment of quality of life and the recognition that quality of life gets with skin disease, which I think is still an evolving and important aspect of patient care. So just a quick start just to quickly disclose that I'm employed by Cardiff University, which receives an income from the use of the DLQI. And what I'll do is I'll quickly go through what we actually consider as quality of life, the impact of vitiligo on quality of life, and then talk a little bit about the DLQI and its role in vitiligo management and quality of life assessment. So I'd like to just start with a quick question of what is quality of life. Apologies, a little spelling there, but what is quality of life? We abbreviate that as QOL. What do we actually consider as part of an important aspect of our life? The reason I've got this picture of COVID is because I think for a lot of people, especially people who are fortunate enough to have healthy lives without any skin disease or any other medical health problem, COVID really gave them an idea of what the impact can be on quality of life when you're shut down in your house for various reasons, when you've got COVID, when you can't see your family or friends, when you can't interact. And I think the idea and a sort of a taste of quality of life impact could really be felt by millions and millions of people across the world. Even when I was sitting at home, initially with the COVID lockdown, before I myself was redeployed to COVID wards, I had a considerable impact on my quality of life just because I couldn't go out to the local shop. And one of the things that really struck me is, well, people with various problems, various skin conditions or diseases, they are in this situation day in, day out. For various reasons, they are unable to interact socially, unable to go out. And I finally found, in a way, I could have a small understanding, nowhere near, what it might be for some people, but of what quality of life impact can be like. And and that was really the situation with COVID. We saw people were unable to see their grandparents. Even in my case, it was very difficult seeing children. People who started their university lives, they had a very unusual start of their university lives, locked in, all lessons online. We often think the first year of our university is where we engage with a lot of people and meet new friends, but it was a completely new environment and completely new way of living. And in some ways, we have reached this sort of hybrid format now. But I think everyone had this taste of what it's like to have your quality of life impacted. And so when you look at quality of life, how do we define it? There are various things you would consider. You look at economic status, you look at employment, how's your work being impacted, marital status, whether you're happy, whether you're having difficulties, whether there are relationship issues. These can all impact our definition of quality of life. Our careers, our ambitions, even our personality plays a way. How our personality is shaped can determine the impact on our quality of life. And of course, our faith, if for those people who have faith or religion, these play an important part in quality of life. And expectations, that's a big part of quality of life. There's a lot of ambitions and dreams people have that often can be impacted by various diseases, including vitiligo. And when you combine all of these things, you look at the impact of disease beyond just what's visible, beyond blood tests, beyond what you can see without even speaking to somebody. But actually, when you look at quality of life, it's a very holistic approach to dealing with health problems. In terms of the World Health Organization, the definition of health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. And that's important because often we consider when you have a disease, you can look at it and you see the values in your blood tests are coming down, or you're in the case of vitiligo, you might notice that a patch or two have started to improve. But really, how often do we inquire and ask about the impact on our social and mental well-being, and how we are living our lives day to day? And sometimes that can be really hard to achieve and inquire about in a clinical setting. So there are lots of definitions of quality of life, but my favorite one is really an individual's perception. So it's very subjective. It's about what the person feels, an individual's perception of their position in life in the context of their culture and value systems, because of course that's different for everyone in which they live and in relation to their goals, expectations, standards, and concerns. And so that, for me, raises the bar in terms of what we need to achieve when we treat patients, when we treat people with diseases and skin diseases, is about what their expectations are and where that reality for them is right now, and how we can close that gap. Because ultimately, as clinicians, I believe certainly that we treat patients holistically. It's not just a case of addressing one issue, but ignoring everything else, because everything ultimately is tied together. And so when you look at the case of vitiligo itself and the impact of on vitiligo on quality of life, well, there's lots of studies, lots of data around prevalence, and we know that anywhere between 0.5 to 2% of adults and children are affected globally across various parts of the world. And lots of studies have shown that vitiligo can have a considerable impact on quality of life and the psychosocial impact that, to be honest, it's a bit late when we recognize it, but was recognized since the 1970s. That's the first time that it was really highlighted by Porter et al. In a publication about the psychological reaction to chronic diseases, including vitiligo. And certainly there has been stigma associated with vitiligo for many years. Hippocrates didn't discriminate between leprosy and vitiligo. And unfortunately, that still exists in certain parts of the world where, unfortunately, people with vitiligo are misunderstood, misrepresented, and in some cultures, studies have shown there can be a reason for divorce. And of course, in terms of sexual relations, there has been lots of studies that it can impact intimate relationships. Because of the nature of vitiligo, I think it's extremely important to, of course, we realize that vitiligo is a very physical and visible condition. And I think that relates to the impact it can have on patients' quality of life. And as a result, patients can feel frightened and embarrassed. And this can be linked to depression and anxiety, and eventually linking to low self-esteem and isolation. And of course, the nature of vitiligo is such that sometimes it can spread, and that spreading of lesions can cause considerable anxiety and sadness in patients. And as I mentioned, because the vitiligo is so visible, it can really cause stigmatization, which unfortunately is still something that exists, and people like the Vitiligo Society are trying very hard to tackle and doing an excellent job of it. But there was a study with the Vitiligo UK Society, a survey where over half of patients with vitiligo have said that they have moderate to a severe impact on quality of life, and that's a significant number. And when you have this sort of impact on quality of life, it can cause a lot of stress, and that burden of skin disease is considerable. And I think it's important to understand that when you think of a disease that's causing anxiety, sadness, is causing isolation, then what is the impact on our day-to-day life in terms of going to work? What is the financial burden of that? Missing days at school, missing work days. And actually, studies have shown that when you have vitiligo onset at adolescence, that is a risk factor for greater impact on quality of life. In fact, 95% of teenagers were bothered by the vitiligo in a study compared with 50% of children. So there's studies to suggest that actually as you reach that adolescence, the impact can be a lot worse for teenagers because of that age, that age where, of course, you're growing, you're learning, and the environment can be quite a brutal environment for these children and for teenagers. So it's something really important to understand and recognize that. And this is one of the things where clinical correlation may not necessarily correlate with quality of life impact. So it might be that only 1 or 2% of a body surface area is impacted, but the impact on quality of life is so much more, that that it can have such a gross impact on mental health, that often clinicians, we may not necessarily pick that up. When you're looking at children in teens, especially, can impact long-standing self-esteem. And studies have shown that this can be an ongoing thing. It can cause trauma, mood disturbances, lost days in school, and actually sports restriction. And sports is one of those things where, if you have vitiligo, that's on obvious parts of your body, and children can feel embarrassed changing into sports clothes, or wearing sports clothes and exposing parts of their body, and that can have a considerable impact. So that has other health issues and other health implications that we need to identify as dermatologists and as a society. And I'll talk about the DLQI, but there can be a huge, as a result of all these various impacts on quality of life, there can be a huge variation in quality of life scores, which I'll talk about in the coming few slides. And the other thing I wanted to really touch upon is a concept known as the greater patient. And I love that this concept exists, because, of course, people suffering with vitiligo have such an impact on their quality of life. But that impact on quality of life can spill over to those around that patient. And this is the concept known as greater patient. It's the concept to describe the immediate close social group that's affected by a person having skin disease. And this is recognized across all conditions, including vitiligo. If a child has vitiligo, how does that impact the parents? If a spouse has vitiligo, how does that affect the other spouse, or the partners, or the friends? And this is something that's being researched and looked into. There's a good study published in the American Journal of Clinical Dermatology, where they asked the quality of life in family members of vitiligo patients. And with regards to parents in particular, lots of aspects came about. There's significant psychosocial problems with parents. They themselves have a poor quality of life because of children having poor quality of life. There can be an emotional impact. And of course, there's that burden of care. Parents feel responsible for children, and of course, parents also feel the impact of reaction of others, the reaction of other families, other members, other parents, and so that can have a knock-on effect on social life, physical well-being, and also relationships, not just between the spouses, but extended family. So I think when we look at the quality of life impact of vitiligo, it's not just the case of looking at it at an individual level, but also looking at it from a wider lens, because that helps us to give an even more holistic approach. And when you're looking at how you measure quality of life, that's important. And there's been lots of studies on this. And essentially, there are three ways of capturing quality of life impact. You can have generic questionnaires. So these are generic, such as the short form 12, and there are many others that exist. And the benefit of these are they're very generic. They just ask very open-ended questions that are not specific to a disease or even a specialty. So that would necessarily, that means that, okay, it's straightforward. You can get economic health data from that. But you could argue that actually they're not very specific to skin. So that's where we have specialty-specific skin questionnaires. So DLQI, which I will talk about, Skindex is another popular one. And then you get even more disease specific. So you have things like the Vitiligo Impact Scale, or the Vitiligo Specific Health-Related Quality of Life Instrument. And these look at the impact specifically to vitiligo. So there are pros and cons of having a very generic to getting more focal information. And it just really depends on what you prefer individually, what patients prefer. And I suppose that's a whole presentation in and of itself. But there was a meta-analysis in 2017 by Marson and co. And they found that there was a huge heterogeneity in the way that vitiligo is being monitored and the outcomes are being captured. But one thing was sure, that the quality of life loss in darker skin types and South Asian population was significantly more. And when you look at the BAD guidelines, and I think there's going to be a talk about that, but certainly quality of life measurement is recommended, and that's on top of any sort of clinical scores or any other clinical assessment that we do. And because of this diverse heterogeneity in the measurement of vitiligo and the outcome measurement, there's been a consensus that was published as well for core outcomes in vitiligo, and this is great ongoing work. And what I like to just mention here is, there's an interesting concept of whether we should be looking at quality of life as a primary outcome. It's not about looking at surface area. So sure, someone's surface area of skin involvement is important, for example, but is quality of life equally important, or is it more important? And you can have debates about this. But what we do know is that it is very important, and it's equally, if not more important, certainly in my opinion. So there's lots of talk about this, and there's lots of place for quality of life measurement going forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the DLQI, which is really the focus of this talk. And this was developed in 1994 as one of the first skin-specific quality of life questionnaires. And you can see that there's 10 items you can see on the right side of the screen. And I'll be honest, this is something which, like I said, I never knew existed until I started dermatology, and I started my love for dermatology about over a decade ago. And I realized it's such a fantastic little tool. You know, there's 10 questions asking about all different aspects of your life. It looks at symptoms, looks at psychosocial aspects, daily life, and you know, how does it impact your sport, which I mentioned has an impact. You know, with children, certainly your work, your studies, your intimate relationships, and treatment impact of, you know, various creams that you have to use, or if you have to go regularly for treatment every week, for example, then, you know, this sort of thing. And it captures this sort of information with all skin diseases, and that's certainly the validation of the DLQI. And it is the most commonly used quality of life measure in dermatology, and is recommended as one of the outcome measures in the BAD guidelines for vitiligo, amongst the others that I mentioned in the previous, but DLQI is certainly one of them. And there's over 110 translations that have been extensively validated. And what I mean by validated means that the questionnaires have been tested, that they represent the original language, which is in the UK English, and that they capture the key concepts that we want to capture. It takes 2 minutes on average to complete, which, to be honest, in practice is usually much quicker, you know, much less than that. And it covers the impact on quality of life over the last week, rather than a more longer term, obviously over the last year, because we know that skin disease can change quite frequently, and it can vary. So it's a 1 week recall. You can almost do it weekly. And the total score is out of 30. So if you have the worst possible quality of life, you will score 30 out of 30. There's 10 items, and each one scores a maximum of 3. About a couple of years ago, we validated this electronically. It existed on paper version, and we created an app, and I'll talk about that coming on. But of course, DLQI is not a perfect measure. There are concerns whether it underrepresents the emotional aspect. It's not a mental health screening tool, and there are other mental health screening tools available, and certainly the DLQI doesn't do that particularly well. And there has been a lot of criticism about the not relevant response, as you can see from questions 3 onwards. For example, just looking at question 4, for example, over the last week, how much has your skin influenced the clothes you wear? You know, it could be that, you know, you're in your lockdown, for example, and so it's not really relevant, but that doesn't really impact that if you're really going out and about. Or what about sport? How much has your skin made it difficult for you to do any sport? You could say not relevant because you've not done any sport, but the reality is possibly you've not done any sport because of the fact that you were so embarrassed by your skin. So, you know, there can be, and if you tick not relevant, that scores 0, which means that it has no impact on your quality of life. So we can understand that, you know, that there are certain criticisms of the DLQI. It's not perfect, but it has been validated, has been used in many vitiligo studies, and does measure what it's meant to measure. There's also a children's version. This is the cartoon version, as there is a text version as well. Is just really just to mention that that is out there should people wish to use it. So the DLQI validated that in an electronic format in 2017. And though it might seem like an obvious thing to suggest that the electronic version is same as the paper version, in any sort of scientific endeavor, you have to prove it. So we had 104 patients which used the paper version and the electronic version, and just to see whether they would answer them equally, whether there was any difficulties, any concerns. And actually, there was a significant preference for the electronic format, even though almost a fifth of the patients had never used a tablet before. And of course, vitiligo does impact a lot of young people, but it can come on later in life, as we know. So certainly in the more elderly generation, they may not be used to electronic use, but despite that, 76% preferred iPads. And then because we had proved that electronic validation of the DLQI works, it's absolutely fine to use electronically. We made an official app that was released in early 2022, and we tested it globally pre-release, and we've added various major languages of the world, and hopefully more to be coming. As you know, as I mentioned earlier, there are over 110 languages, but this process does take time. We have to make sure that the transfer onto electronic format is done correctly and without any errors. So I'm just going to quickly go through the app. The good news is it's available on both iOS and Android. So if you just type in DLQI, the official app, it will come up as you can see on the screen here. Once you download it and you open up the app, you can see that on the left, you press start button and you start going through all the 10 questions. And this is excellent for patients because you just quickly tap in your answers in terms of how it impacts you. There's also number 7, which has 2 parts. So if you say, for example, over the last week, has your skin prevented you from working or studying? If it hasn't prevented you, i.e. stopped you, if you say no, then you get part 2. And so then they ask you, if you have been going to work and studying, then how much of an impact has there been on your skin? And when you finished all the 10 questions, you get the thank you, completed the questionnaire, and your final score. And then this will tell you, you can see at the bottom, how much of an impact your skin disease has on your quality of life. And I'll show you what that actually looks like. So when you click see previous scores, you can see all your scores that you've done over the last year or so. And you can see a record of how your quality of life has been changing. And it also tells you at the bottom a little score banding, which has been validated in the DLQI. It shows you, if, whether there's a great impact or a small impact or no impact at all from your skin disease. And it's good that this stays on your phone, so there is no sharing of information. It does not upload the scores anywhere, so it's completely confidential. If you go to clicking more info at the bottom of the screen, then you can also see different aspects of the copyright, the data confidentiality statement, which I've just said. You can learn more about the DLQI and actually guidance of use of the DLQI, so how to use it, how to score it, because there are different ways of doing that in terms of whether you miss 1 question or 2 questions and how would you score that, is it still valid, and all of those concerns really. So using in vitiligo, DLQI is an excellent tool available in the toolbox for both clinicians and patients because it allows easy weekly monitoring of quality of life impact. The problem with paper, there are pros and cons, of course. Paper is cheap, but of course, you're talking about long-term, paper conservation and things like that. So having it on an iPad format or on an iPhone, it's very easy to do. You've got it on your phone. You can do it before you see your clinician, and you can show your scores, and the clinician can have a look at the impact of your scores over the last couple of months and see whether treatment is working, for example. So just the fact that you can have this access and collection of your quality of life information on your own app is great. It can streamline consultations. So we've been doing a lot of this, certainly with our psoriasis clinics. Patients get electronic DLQIs before they come to the clinic, and there's no need to then do that. It saves a bit of time in clinic, and patients can do that before coming. And it's important because I think if you have access to the ease of scoring your quality of life impact, then you can implement this information into your management decisions. You can say, look, this is, this treatment is fine, is good, but actually my quality of life is still impacted in X, Y, Z way. You can look at the individual questions. You can see, okay, this is impacting actually what you're wearing, your clothes is impacting your work, and you can have more focused consulting in terms of what's being impacted in your life. And this important, it's important because again, it allows us to measure the impact of any treatment along with just the clinical scores, like the area surface and so forth. And the good thing about having an easy to access app on your phone is because it embeds this quality of life data in long-term management and research. It means that as clinicians, as patients, we are putting emphasis and importance on quality of life management and quality of life recording with regards to skin disease, but vitiligo also in particular. So just to really sum up what I've mentioned, there's a significant impact because of on quality of life because of vitiligo, and it's not just adults. Adolescents and children, of course, we know are impacted, and relatives is the unseen patient, the greater patient. I think is something to bear in mind. It's something we don't always understand because a patient might come by themselves or a relative. You're talking to the patient and you don't understand what's actually happening behind the scenes. The greater burden, burden on social life, quality of life, family life, economic burden. And this is important because it's an important part of the patient-doctor consultation. The more easier we make this access, the better it would be for patients, but clinicians, and also for the vitiligo research going forward. There isn't an ideal measure. I'm not saying the DLQI is perfect. I'm here to talk about the DLQI because, of course, it's one of the major used measures in the world. There are others that you might find that more suited to you. But the DLQI works, it's been validated, and it's available in several languages. There is a question whether we should look at quality of life measurement as a primary outcome. And that can be debated, but certainly what we do know, it is an important part of assessing a patient's response to disease and impact of disease. Now, the app is available worldwide. You can download it and store it on your phone. And I'd just like to add again, quality of life research is so important, it's so crucial for patient well-being and assessing innovative vitiligo treatments going forward. So I'd just like to thank you for tuning into that quick whistle-stop tour of quality of life impact and the DLQI app, which is now available. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Faraz. I mean, just on a personal level, I think I speak for a lot of people probably on the call that when they were diagnosed, for me, it was 20 years ago. This is absolutely light years ahead of what was available then to me as a precocious teenager.
Yes.
And it's it really resonated with me. I mean, at the time, my quality of life was definitely impacted very significantly. As I'm approaching sort of middle age, I don't really care anymore. It's just part of who I am, and if anything, I'm proud of it. And I actually see it as a strength and a way of having a whole new perspective on life that I would not have been able to have otherwise.
Very inspiring.
I'm also really struck by some of the different journeys of people who approach the society that they tell us about. There's one particular individual who's come to mind who both of his parents had vitiligo, but he didn't. And vitiligo had a huge impact on his self-esteem, on his outlook, on his identity, even though he didn't actually have the condition.
Wow.
So I guess, would you see people like that still being able to participate in the app with those sorts of circumstances?
Absolutely. I think so. I think they are the greater patient that I was talking about. They're the sort of people who are surrounded by people with vitiligo, even though they may not have vitiligo, but they're also impacted in a way. And the problem is the infrastructure probably isn't there to give support to these people like this person you mentioned who's had parents with vitiligo, but he himself doesn't suffer with it. Who would he go to see, and what sort of support can he get? So I think that's why things like the Vitiligo Society is fantastic, gives the exact support that you need. But the DLQI absolutely is a great option. But there are also family now. There's a huge boom in the family reported outcome measures. So if Cardiff University, we have something called the From16, the family reported outcome measure. Because of time restriction, I couldn't talk about it, but that's a quality of life tool that measures the quality of life impact on family members of people with any medical problem, including skin disease, but it can be used across all of medicine. And there's also the FDLQI, which is the family DLQI, which you can look at. And this can help identify impact on quality of life of family members. And I think there's a huge surge of interest in this area. And it's important because, they are being, sometimes studies have shown that the quality of life impact for family members can be as high as people with the actual disease. And so I'm glad you brought that up, and you're absolutely right. And they're also so dependent on the sort of situation and the cultural background they're in. I mean, while doing a bit of research on vitiligo and quality of impact, there was a chap from abroad in Southeast Asia who called one of the vitiligo societies and asked about options for amputation for his arm for vitiligo, because of the impact that it was having on his life. And it's so sad to read about this sort of thing, because I think that that person clearly had a great impact on quality of life. And it's just that support needs to be there, and that understanding. And that's why now, even if we know how the NHS is right now and the impact on time, if I can ask even one question, how are you, and how's it impacting your life? I think that makes a big difference, and I think patients appreciate that. But it's not everything, but it's something. And I think if anything is taken away from this, it's just people understand quality of life impact and inquire about it. Keep in the back of your minds whenever you're talking about this sort of any sort of problem in your consultation.
Thank you. We do have one question from the Q&A if we have
Yes,
time.
sure.
So this is from Rob, one of our fantastic trustees at the Vitiligo Society. So he's pointed out that we're in the process of commissioning a patient survey for people with vitiligo to better understand how we as a charity can support their needs. So we haven't done one for a very long time, and we want to make sure that we are pointing our resources at the services and the support mechanisms that mean the most to people. So Rob's question is there any aggregate level data that could be shared to avoid duplicating aspects of our planned survey?
There's certainly none that we have conducted at the moment, and because we don't store the data from these apps for confidentiality reasons, there isn't any that we are aware of, or certainly that we're leading on at the moment. So we'd be very happy to have a chat with the Vitiligo Society, and if you wanted to use any of the tools, we'd be happy to support you in that. If you wanted to use that for any sort of surveys, that'd be absolutely fine.
Super. Well, we'll definitely be signposting our members towards the app. And as we progress and start to get some data from our survey, it'd be great to check back in with you and see if we can
happy to help. Thank you for inviting me.
Collaborate on that.